Sophie, Human Rights Watch has described the human rights situation in China as dire and deteriorating. What worries you the most?
Oh, it's a big question. I think arguably the biggest problem since Xi Jinping came to power in March of 2013 is an extraordinary crackdown on independent civil society across China. Writers, activists, public health workers, feminists. This is a community that had really grown and, carved out a bit of room to work, to challenge legislation, to comment publicly. And really, since she came to office, we've seen dozens, hundreds of those people imprisoned, prosecuted, or effectively sent into exile. Some of them disappeared. And this is a huge loss, we think, for China.
What kind of influence do you think other countries actually have? Because obviously, not just Canada, but other countries are doing business with China and want to do more business with China. What influence do you think they can actually have?
Well, I think they actually can have a fair amount. I mean, not only do I think Chinese leaders still care about how China is seen and perceived internationally, they certainly don't like being embarrassed when they're challenged over the treatment of, for example, 2010 Nobel Peace Prize winner Liu Xiaobo, who's still sitting in prison. I think also, the boundary between human rights and other realms like trade and security are not, those are not two wildly different realms. The same laws or the same legal system in China that can uphold, a given business's contract is the same legal system that can actually guarantee a Chinese person's right to the freedom of expression, which they're guaranteed. And if you're not going to get the one, you're not going to get the other either. So I do think that there's broad interest, regardless of what sort of piece of this relationship you're interested in improving human rights. It makes China a better partner across the board.
Diplomats often talk about achieving some kind of balance, right, between, negotiating on the business side of things and the security side of things and dealing with human rights. Is it just that Western countries haven't been forthright enough?
Well, I think there are a couple of different kinds of problems. One is that Western countries have become more reticent as China has become more influential economically and diplomatically over the last decade. I think also Western governments often confuse the Chinese government with China. And lots of independent voices or organizations or people outside the government wind up being left out of the thinking and left out of the equation. And as a result, certain issues sort of drop down to the bottom of the agenda. And one thing that Canada has generally done well over the years is reach out to independent activists or peaceful critics. But we're not seeing the kind of high-level interaction with those sorts of people that we think helps give them or keeps their place in a very delicate environment in contemporary Chinese politics.
So you're saying that high-level Canadian officials need to reach out more to those activists? Is that?
Yeah, generally. I mean, Canadian ambassadors and the staff in China has generally been quite good about this. When you think about, for example, the optics of Prime Minister Trudeau greeting senior Chinese officials, in lovely settings in Canada, along with, Trudeau's and other Canadian government officials' welcome to refugees and other kinds of people who might not be liked by the governments they come from, you want to see people like Prime Minister Trudeau being photographed with people who are peacefully critical of the Chinese government. It's that kind of, I think, recognition and a demonstration that Canada is interested not just in what the Chinese government says, but in what its critics have to say, too.
Canada is talking about a free trade agreement with Beijing, and they're in sort of preliminary talks. What should the approach be there, from your point of view?
Well, we have no complaints generally either with FTAs or with issues like extradition treaties, which Canada is also talking about with China. But I think the concern in either of those realms is really about whether the Chinese legal system can actually follow through on the kinds of commitments that those sorts of agreements depend on. The Chinese political system, the Chinese legal system is deeply politicized. It is heavily influenced by the Chinese Communist Party, and whether it really can be an independent arbiter of whatever agreements are reached, I think is a very open question.
To what extent do you think human rights are holding China back?
I think it will be very difficult for China to see through this extraordinary social, economic, environmental transition absent meaningful human rights protections. It's hard to imagine how the economy continues to grow or how China integrates into the rest of the world when people are still not even able to air their political views without fear of persecution. It's hard to see how China is a responsible player domestically and internationally on things like public health or the environment, when the people who are blowing the whistle on, local toxic spills or public health crises like SARS, aren't allowed to report those things publicly, and they wind up being the ones who are sent to jail. I think the lack of rights protections really hampers China's development across quite a few different kinds of issues.
Thank you very much for your expertise on this.
Thank you.